They say an alpha's power lives in his command, in the way his voice can break a defiant wolf's will or how his presence alone can silence a room of hundreds. But Lucien Varin had learned the hardest truth of leadership. True strength isn't what you possess, it's what remains when everyone believes you have nothing left. 21 days. That's how long he'd been playing dead. 504 hours of shallow breathing, of letting his pack see their unbreakable alpha reduced to something pitiful and broken. Each morning he lay in his quarters while the Crescent Moon pack gathered beyond his door, their whispers carrying through the walls like poison seeping through cracks. The incantation of lies grew more elaborate each passing day, staged wounds that wouldn't heal, trembling hands that couldn't hold a glass. The complete absence of the alpha command that once pulsed through every member of his 150 wolves like a second heartbeat. He had orchestrated his own destruction with the precision of a master strategist. The ambush at the northern border. The catastrophic injuries. The terrifying announcement that his wolf was gone, severed from him like a limb cut clean through. No one questioned it because alphas didn't fake weakness. It was unthinkable, impossible, beneath the dignity of their station. No one suspected that beneath his performance of helplessness lived the same brutal strength that had held this pack together for 12 years. That every labored breath was calculated. That he was watching, cataloging, remembering every single betrayal. Now at 34, whatever age meant to an alpha who'd seen his father overthrown by ambitious wolves who smiled while sharpening their knives, Lucien lay in the pre-dawn darkness of his private quarters, listening to the methodical footsteps approaching. The only footsteps that had approached with genuine concern in 3 weeks. The other wolves called her worthless, a cruel assessment that made something protective and savage stir in Lucien's chest even as he forced himself to remain still. Worthless because she was an omega in a pack that valued strength above all else. Worthless because she scrubbed floors while others trained for battle. If only they knew she was the only creature in this entire compound who still saw him as worth protecting. The only one who didn't smell opportunity in his blood. Marin Alira moved through his room like a ghost, her presence barely disturbing the air. She'd been 23 when she first arrived at the pack house, absorbed from a destroyed neighboring territory. Just another broken omega seeking refuge, willing to accept the bottom rung of their hierarchy in exchange for survival. No one questioned another quiet girl with downcast eyes and a willingness to endure the casual cruelties they dealt her daily. No one suspected that beneath her plain exterior lived a loyalty so pure it made every other bond in this pack look like a counterfeit. The door to his quarters rattled open, bringing the sharp scent of cleaning solution and something darker, fear laced with determination. "The beta is coming," Marin whispered, her voice barely audible as she moved to his bedside with fresh bandages clutched in trembling hands. "Darius is calling the pack council. He's saying it's time. Time to end the test. Time to see if anyone would step between an alpha and his execution. Time to discover if the only wolf worth saving in the entire Crescent Moon pack was the one they'd all dismissed as beneath their notice." Chapter 1. The ambush had been brutally convincing. Lucien made sure of that. He'd chosen the northern ridge deliberately, where the territory line blurred into disputed land and rogues occasionally tested their borders. He'd gone alone, dismissing his guards with orders that seemed routine, but were calculated to leave him vulnerable. When he triggered the trap, he'd spent weeks preparing silver-laced nets, carefully positioned attackers he'd paid in advance, wounds staged to look catastrophic without actually crippling him. The performance had to be flawless. It was. He'd returned to the pack house 3 weeks ago carried on a stretcher, his beta Darius orchestrating the rescue with theatrical concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. Blood soaked through Lucien's clothes, real enough to smell, but shallow enough to heal within hours if he'd allowed it. He didn't. He kept the wounds raw and weeping, forced his wolf to retreat so deeply that even the most sensitive noses couldn't detect its presence. The pack had gathered in the Great Hall, their collective grief a palpable wave that might have moved him if he hadn't been cataloging which faces showed genuine distress versus those that flickered with something darker. Opportunity. Calculation. Hunger. The alpha's wolf is severed, their pack healer had announced, her voice breaking on the words. She at least had been sincere. "I've never seen anything like it. It's as if the bond was cut clean through. Without his wolf, without the Alpha command." She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Without those things, Lucien was just a man. Mortal. Replaceable. That's when Darius had stepped forward, his hand on the healer's shoulder in a gesture of comfort that was really about positioning himself at the center of the crisis. "We'll care for him, of course. Around-the-clock supervision. Only the most trustworthy attendants." Which was how Marin ended up in his quarters that first night, arriving with an armful of clean linens and fear radiating from her like heat from a flame. She'd stood in the doorway for a full minute before entering, as if crossing that threshold might shatter some fundamental rule of pack hierarchy. Omegas didn't tend to alphas. They weren't considered clean enough, important enough, trusted enough. But Darius had chosen her precisely because she was expendable. If the injuries were contagious somehow, if whatever had severed Lucien's wolf could spread, better to risk an Omega than anyone who mattered. Lucien had watched her through half-closed eyes as she approached his bed with steps so quiet they barely registered. Her hands shook as she reached for the soiled bandages, and he'd forced himself to remain absolutely still, to keep his breathing shallow and pained. The test had to be perfect. No one could suspect. Then her fingers brushed against his forearm, just a whisper of contact as she began unwinding the gauze, and everything in Lucien's carefully constructed performance nearly shattered. Because her touch carried something he hadn't anticipated. Recognition. Not of who he was. Every wolf in this compound knew their alpha, but of what he was. Her hands stilled for the briefest moment, barely a heartbeat's pause, and her scent shifted. Not with fear or disgust or the ambitious satisfaction he'd smelled on everyone else. With confusion. And beneath that, buried so deep he almost missed it, suspicion. She knew. Or she sensed something at least. Something wrong with the picture before her. Marin's breathing had quickened, her pulse visible in the hollow of her throat as she continued her work with deliberate care. She cleaned wounds that should have been mortal, wounds that smelled wrong somehow, too controlled, too precise. Her movements grew mechanical, as if she was processing a truth her mind couldn't fully accept. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to strain to hear it, even with his enhanced senses. "Forgive me, Alpha." Just those 3 words, an apology for touching him without permission, for being in his space, for existing. But her hands, still resting against his skin as she secured a fresh bandage, trembled with something that wasn't just fear. She didn't say anything else. She finished her work in silence, gathered the soiled linens, and disappeared from his room like smoke dissipating. But Lucien knew, with the certainty that had made him alpha in the first place, that Marin Alira had just become the most dangerous variable in his entire carefully orchestrated test. Not because she would expose him, but because she would choose to stay silent, even knowing the truth, and that made her either the most loyal wolf he'd ever encountered or the most foolish. 3 weeks later, he still wasn't sure which. But he was beginning to hope it was the former. Chapter 2. The corruption started small, like rot spreading from a single bad seed. Darius was too clever to make his move all at once. He understood that power taken quickly was power easily lost, so he worked in increments, each change reasonable enough to escape immediate suspicion. First came the schedules. Within 48 hours of Lucien's incapacitation, the Beta had restructured the guard rotations under the guise of increased security. Wolves who'd served Lucien for years suddenly found themselves reassigned to patrol the outer territories, far from the main compound. Those who remained near the Alpha's quarters were Darius's people, younger wolves who'd chafed under Lucien's strict leadership, ambitious pack members who saw opportunity in chaos. Marin noticed because she existed in the spaces between importance. She was the shadow that scrubbed the council room floors while the inner circle met. The ghost who polished the hallway sconces while warriors passed by discussing matters they assumed were beneath her understanding. Omegas weren't supposed to have opinions, weren't supposed to listen or remember or care about pack politics. So they spoke freely around her, as if she were furniture. The northern patrols need experienced wolves, Gamma Marcus had argued during one of the hastily called meetings, his voice carrying through the council room door as Marin knelt outside, scrubbing at a stain that had been gone for 10 minutes. Taking all of Lucien's loyalists off the main compound feels necessary. Darius cut him off smoothly. If something happens again, if whoever attacked our alpha returns, we need warriors who can respond without emotional compromise. The wolves who served him closely are too grief-stricken to be effective right now. Marin's hands stilled on the floor. Grief-stricken. As if the wolves Darius had banished to the borders were mourning rather than being deliberately removed from positions where they might interfere with his plans. The resource diversion came next, subtle enough that most of the pack didn't notice. Emergency funds meant for territory defense suddenly rerouted to medical expenses that never seemed to reach the Alpha's care. Supply shipments that should have gone to the entire pack began favoring wolves in Darius's inner circle. The kitchen rations shifted, more meat for the warriors loyal to the Beta, less for everyone else. Marin felt the change in her own belly. The Omegas had always eaten last, survived on scraps and leftovers, but now even those scraps grew scarcer. When she'd quietly mentioned it to the head cook, the older woman had just shaken her head with weary resignation. Beta's orders, she'd muttered. Resources are tight with the Alpha down. We all have to make sacrifices. But Darius wasn't sacrificing anything. His wolves ate well. They laughed in the halls. They carried themselves with the swagger of victors even though no battle had been fought. The isolation of Lucien was perhaps the most insidious change. Darius implemented it under the pretense of protection, claiming the Alpha needed absolute rest to have any hope of recovery. Visiting hours became restricted, then eliminated entirely except for essential care. The healer's access was limited to brief checks morning and evening, always with one of Darius's wolves present. Even the pack's elders, who should have had unrestricted access to their Alpha, found themselves turned away at the door. Only Marin maintained consistent access, precisely because no one considered her a threat. She was just the Omega who changed bedding and emptied chamber pots, too insignificant to influence anything, too powerless to matter. She learned to make herself even smaller during those visits, to move through Lucien's quarters like a whisper while Darius's guards stood watch outside. They never questioned why she took so long, never wondered what an Omega and an unconscious Alpha might have to discuss. They played cards in the hallway and talked about their futures in Darius's new regime while Marin listened from the other side of the door. When he takes the title officially, one guard began. When, his companion laughed. You mean if the Alpha doesn't recover? That's weeks away still. Come on, Marcus. We all know Lucien's not recovering. The healer said his wolf is gone. Without that, he's just meat waiting to rot. Darius is being respectful, giving him time for a dignified end, but we all see where this is heading. The challenge, right? Won't be necessary if he dies naturally. Which he will. You've seen him. He's barely breathing. Marin's hands clenched around the linens she was folding, her nails biting into her palms hard enough to draw blood. She forced herself to keep moving, to maintain the rhythm of her tasks while rage and helplessness warred in her chest. They were going to kill him. Not directly, not yet, but through neglect and isolation and the slow starvation of resources that should have been supporting his care. And when he finally died from their manufactured abandonment, Darius would step into his place with clean hands and sympathetic speeches about tragic losses. The pack would accept it because they always accepted what their leaders told them, because questioning meant risking your position, your safety, your life. She should stay silent. That was the smart choice, the Omega choice. Keep her head down, survive this transition, hope that whoever led next would be no worse than whoever led before. But when she looked at Lucien's still form, at the man everyone believed was broken and dying, she saw something they'd all missed in their rush to seize power. She saw someone worth fighting for, even if the fight would destroy her. Chapter 3. It happened on the 17th day, when Marin was carrying fresh water to Lucien's quarters and the illusion of respectful mourning finally shattered completely. Gamma Brennan stood outside the Alpha's door, a laundry basket balanced on his hip filled with what looked like kitchen rags, stained, reeking of spoiled meat and something worse. He was younger than most of the inner circle, maybe 25, with the kind of cruelty that came from having just enough power to hurt people, but not enough to face real consequences. Before Lucien's fall, Brennan had been nothing. A mid-ranked wolf who ran messages and took orders. Now, with Darius's favor elevating anyone willing to demonstrate loyalty to the new regime, he carried himself like royalty. "Move," he said when he saw Merrin approaching, not even bothering to look at her directly. She stepped aside, pressing herself against the wall as she'd been trained to do, making herself small and invisible. But Brennan didn't continue past her. Instead, he reached for the door handle to Lucien's quarters. "The Alpha is resting," Merrin said quietly, the words automatic. The healer said. "The healer says a lot of things," Brennan interrupted, shouldering the door open. "Doesn't change the fact that laundry needs doing, and since our mighty Alpha isn't using his room for much except dying, might as well make it useful." He walked inside, and Merrin's stomach dropped as she understood what he intended. She set down her water pitcher and followed, knowing she shouldn't, knowing it was dangerous, but unable to stop herself. Lucien lay motionless on his bed, exactly as she'd left him that morning. Pale, breathing shallow, every inch the broken Alpha he was pretending to be. Brennan didn't even glance at him as he appended the laundry basket, dumping the filthy rags directly onto the floor beside Lucien's bed, some landing on the edge of the mattress itself. "There," Brennan said with satisfaction. "Omega can sort through this mess while she's playing nursemaid. Make her earn her scraps." The smell was overwhelming, putrid enough to make Merrin's eyes water. This wasn't just dirty laundry. This was deliberate degradation, a message that the Alpha's space was no longer sacred, that he commanded no more respect than a storage closet. "Take it out," Merrin heard herself say, her voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the room like a blade. "Please, take it out." Brennan turned to look at her then, and his expression shifted from indifference to something predatory. "What did you just say to me?" "The Alpha," she started, but her throat closed around the words. He was still the Alpha. Still deserved dignity. Still mattered, even if everyone else had decided he didn't. "The Alpha is a corpse who hasn't figured out he's dead yet," Brennan said, crossing the distance between them in 2 strides. He was a full head taller than Merrin, broader, stronger, and he used every inch of that advantage as he loomed over her. "And you're an Omega who just gave me an order. Want to explain what makes you think you have that right?" Merrin's survival instincts screamed at her to back down, to drop her eyes and apologize and accept whatever punishment came. 23 years of conditioning, of learning that resistance only made things worse, of understanding that Omegas who challenged their betters didn't last long. But she thought about the guards in the hallway discussing Lucien's death like it was inevitable. About Darius systematically dismantling everything the Alpha had built. About how every single wolf in this compound had decided that power mattered more than loyalty, that strength mattered more than honor. "He's still your Alpha," she said, forcing the words past the fear constricting her chest. "This is still his room. You can't just..." The slap came fast enough that she didn't see it coming, Brennan's open palm connecting with her cheek with enough force to snap her head sideways. Pain exploded across her face, bright and sharp, followed by the copper taste of blood as her teeth cut into the inside of her mouth. "I can do whatever I want," Brennan said conversationally, as if he'd just commented on the weather rather than struck her. "Because Darius runs this pack now, and Darius doesn't waste time on sentiment. The Alpha is finished. Anyone who hasn't figured that out yet is going to learn the hard way." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, and shoved her toward the door. Merrin stumbled, catching herself against the doorframe, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. "Clean up that laundry," Brennan ordered. "And next time you think about giving me orders, remember that I'm a Gamma and you're nobody. The only reason you're still breathing is because you're too worthless to bother killing." He left, his footsteps echoing down the hall, and Merrin stood frozen in the doorway, her cheek throbbing, her whole body shaking with shock and rage and helplessness. She didn't move until she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it beneath the ringing in her ears. Breathing. Not the shallow, pained breaths of an unconscious man, but something deeper, more controlled. Marin turned slowly to look at Lucien's bed, and though his eyes remained closed, though his body hadn't shifted position at all, she knew with absolute certainty that he was awake. That he'd seen everything. That he'd watched her take a blow meant to defend his dignity, and he'd done nothing to stop it. Because he couldn't. Not yet. Not until whatever test he was running reached its conclusion. She walked back into the room, knelt beside the pile of filthy laundry, and began sorting through it with steady hands, her silence louder than any words could have been. Chapter 4. Darius came at twilight on the 19th day, when the compound was settling into evening routines and most of the pack was gathered in the dining hall. Marin was changing Lucien's bandages. The fake wounds that she now understood were part of whatever elaborate scheme he was running when she heard boots on the stairs. Heavy. Deliberate. The footsteps of someone who wanted to be heard. The beta didn't knock. He simply pushed through the door with 3 of his wolves flanking him, filling the room with their presence, their collective scent of aggression and barely restrained violence, making the air thick and hard to breathe. "Leave us," Darius said without looking at Marin, his attention fixed on Lucien's still form. "I need a private moment with our alpha." Everything in Marin's body screamed at her to obey. Darius wasn't some mid-ranked gamma looking to prove himself. He was the beta, second only to Lucien himself, and defying him was the kind of mistake that ended lives. But she'd seen the way this man operated over the past 3 weeks. She'd watched him dismantle Lucien's authority piece by piece, isolate him, starve him of support and resources. She knew exactly what a private moment meant when the only witness would be an unconscious alpha who couldn't report what happened. "The healer said," Marin started, her voice small but present. "The healer answers to me now," Darius interrupted, finally turning those cold eyes on her. "As do you. So when I tell you to leave, Omega, you leave." His wolves spread out slightly, a predatory formation that made Marin's instincts scream danger. But she remained kneeling beside Lucien's bed, her hands still resting on the half-finished bandage, and she didn't move. Darius's expression shifted, something like amusement flickering across his features. "You're either very brave or very stupid. I haven't decided which yet." He crossed to the bed in 3 long strides, and what happened next made Marin's blood turn to ice. Darius reached down and grabbed Lucien's jaw, his fingers digging into the alpha's face with casual cruelty as he turned Lucien's head from side to side like he was examining a piece of meat. "Look at you," he murmured, his voice carrying the false sympathy of a predator playing with its food. "The mighty Alpha Varen, reduced to this. Can't even open your eyes, can you? Can't even growl at me for touching you without permission." His grip tightened, and Marin saw Lucien's jaw flex, just the tiniest movement, quickly controlled, but enough to tell her the pain was real even if the helplessness wasn't. "I wonder," Darius continued, releasing Lucien's face only to press his palm against the alpha's chest, directly over his heart, "how long we should keep up this charade. You're not recovering. Everyone knows it. The pack needs leadership, and I've been more than patient waiting for you to either wake up or stop breathing. Don't touch him." The words left Marin's mouth before her brain could stop them, propelled by something primal and desperate that overrode every survival instinct she possessed. The room went silent. Even Darius's wolves seemed to freeze, shocked by the sheer audacity of an Omega giving an order to their beta. Darius turned slowly, his hand still pressed against Lucien's chest, and the look on his face was no longer amused. "What did you just say to me?" "Step away from him," Marin said, and she was standing now though she didn't remember rising, her body positioned between Darius and Lucien, like she actually stood a chance of stopping anything this man wanted to do. "Please. Just leave him alone." "Leave him alone," Darius repeated, as if tasting the words. Then he moved, faster than she could track, his hand lashing out to grip her throat. He didn't squeeze, didn't choke, just held her there with enough pressure to make his point. "You just committed treason, little Omega. Do you understand that? Defying a direct order from your beta during a time of crisis. That's punishable by expulsion. Or worse." Marin couldn't speak with his hand on her throat, But she didn't lower her eyes, didn't submit, and that seemed to enrage him more than her words had. "Drag her to the courtyard," Darius ordered his wolves, releasing her with a shove that sent her stumbling backward. "If she wants to defend a dead alpha, let her do it where the whole pack can see what happens to traitors." They grabbed her arms before she could even think about running, hauling her toward the door as panic finally broke through her resolve. "No, wait, I'm sorry." "Too late for sorry," Darius said. He paused at the door, looking back at Lucien's motionless form. "Don't worry, Alpha. I'll make sure she doesn't suffer too long. Consider it my final act of mercy in your name." The courtyard was full. Word had spread fast, the way it always did when violence was promised, and wolves materialized from every corner of the compound to witness the beta's justice. They formed a loose circle, their faces showing everything from bloodlust to pity to carefully neutral indifference. No one stepped forward to stop it. Darius didn't hurry. He made a show of removing his jacket, rolling up his sleeves, explaining to the gathered pack exactly what crime Marin had committed. Treason. Defiance. Choosing a fallen alpha over the wolf who was leading them into their future. The first blow caught her across the face, snapping her head back. The second drove into her ribs, forcing the air from her lungs. She tried to stay standing, tried to maintain some dignity, but Darius was systematic in his brutality. He knew exactly where to hit to cause maximum pain without killing, and he took his time. When Marin finally fell to her knees, blood streaming from her split lip and nose, her eye already swelling shut, Darius crouched in front of her. "Last chance, Omega. Denounce him. Tell everyone here that Lucien Varan is no longer fit to lead, and I'll let you live." Through the blood and pain, Marin met his eyes and said the only thing that mattered. "He's still my alpha." Darius smiled. "Then you'll die as stupidly as you lived." He raised his fist for the killing blow. Chapter 5. The blow never landed. One of the pack elders, Sienna, had stepped forward at the last moment, her authority as a council member just enough to make Darius pause. "Enough," she'd said, her voice cutting through the bloodlust in the courtyard. "She's learned her lesson. Killing an Omega for misguided loyalty serves no purpose except to make us look like savages." Darius had wanted to finish it, Marin could see it in the way his fist trembled with restraint, but he was too politically savvy to alienate the council completely. Not yet. Not when he was so close to legitimizing his takeover. "Get her out of my sight," he'd said instead, turning away like Marin was already dead to him. "And keep her away from the Alpha. She's lost that privilege." But privileges meant nothing when everyone assumed you were too broken to be a threat. The guards who dragged Marin back to the servants' quarters didn't bother posting a watch. Why would they? She could barely walk, could barely see through her swollen eye, and every breath felt like broken glass in her chest. They threw her onto her narrow cot and left her there to heal or die, whichever came first. She chose neither. 3 hours later, when the compound had settled into the deep quiet of midnight, Marin pulled herself upright through sheer force of will. Every movement was agony, her ribs screaming in protest, but she'd survived worse. Not physically, perhaps, but in all the ways that mattered. She'd endured years of smaller cruelties that had prepared her for this moment. The walk to Lucien's quarters felt endless. She took the servants' passages, the narrow corridors that maintenance staff used to move through the compound unseen. Twice she had to stop and lean against the wall, waiting for her vision to clear, tasting blood with every breath. Darius's guards were gone from Lucien's door. Of course they were. Why guard an unconscious alpha when the only person foolish enough to care about him had just been beaten half to death? The door opened silently under her touch, and Marin slipped inside like a ghost, closing it behind her with trembling hands. Lucien lay exactly as she'd left him hours ago, his chest rising and falling with those carefully measured breaths, his face peaceful in the moonlight streaming through the window. He looked like a man at rest, not a man orchestrating the most elaborate test of loyalty she'd ever witnessed. "I know you can hear me," Marin whispered, lowering herself carefully onto the chair beside his bed. Her own wounds needed tending. She could feel blood still seeping from the split in her eyebrow, but she reached for his bandages first, her hands automatically moving through the routine she'd performed dozens of times. I don't know why you're doing this. I don't understand the game you're playing or what you're trying to prove. Her fingers brushed against his skin as she unwound the gauze, and she felt him tense, just the slightest tightening of muscle that confirmed everything she'd suspected. But I need you to know, she continued, her voice barely audible even in the silent room, that whatever happens, I don't regret it. Defending you. Defying Darius. Any of it. She paused, pressing clean bandages against wounds that didn't need them, maintaining the fiction even though they both knew the truth. You're a better alpha unconscious than he'll ever be with all his schemes and power plays. Tears stung her swollen eye, mixing with blood as they tracked down her damaged face. I'm probably going to die for this. Darius won't let it go, he can't, not without looking weak. So this might be the last time I get to say this to you. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to something raw and honest. You matter. Not because you're the alpha, not because you're strong or powerful or any of those things they worship. You matter because when you had everything, you were kind. You were fair. You saw us, the Omegas, the weak ones, the ones everyone else looked through, and you saw us as wolves, not just tools. She finished securing his bandages and finally turned to her own wounds, using the basin of water she'd brought for his care to clean the blood from her face. The reflection in the water showed a stranger swollen, bruised, split open, but she barely recognized the physical damage as important anymore. I wish I understood why you're testing us, Marin whispered, dabbing at her eyebrow with a cloth that came away crimson. What you're looking for. Whether anyone could have passed, or if we were all destined to fail from the start. She laughed, a broken sound that hurt her ribs. Maybe that's the point. Maybe you needed to see what we really are when we think no one's watching. When we think there's no consequence for showing our true selves. She reached for his hand then, holding it between both of hers, feeling the warmth and strength he'd hidden so perfectly beneath the illusion of weakness. I see you, she said simply. I don't know what you're anymore, broken alpha or master manipulator, but I see you. And I'm choosing you anyway, even if it costs me everything. That's when his fingers moved. Not the involuntary twitch of an unconscious man, but a deliberate squeeze, his hand tightening around hers with unmistakable intention. Marin's breath caught. She looked up at his face and found his eyes open, blazing with an intensity that made her whole body freeze. Not the glazed confusion of someone waking from injury, but the sharp, focused awareness of a predator who'd been watching and waiting. Lucien, she breathed, and his name on her lips felt like a secret and a prayer and a confession all at once. He didn't speak. He couldn't, not yet, not without shattering the entire test. But his eyes held hers, and in that gaze she saw everything he couldn't say. Recognition. Gratitude. Possession. A promise that what she'd sacrificed for him would not be forgotten. His thumb traced a gentle circle on the back of her hand once, twice, and then his eyes closed again, his breathing returning to that shallow, controlled rhythm of unconsciousness. But Marin sat there in the darkness, holding the hand of an alpha who'd just silently claimed her as his, and understood that whatever came next, she was no longer alone in this fight. She'd found her mate in the ruins of his test. And he'd found the only soul in his entire pack worth saving. Chapter 6. The gathering was called for dawn on the 21st day, 3 weeks to the hour since Lucien's supposed fall. Darius had chosen the timing deliberately, early enough that no one could claim they weren't informed, but late enough that he'd had time to set every piece of his plan into motion. Marin heard about it from the kitchen staff, who heard it from the guards, who heard it directly from the beta's mouth. Mandatory attendance for all pack members. No exceptions. The future of the Crescent Moon Pack would be decided, and every wolf needed to bear witness. She'd spent the past 2 days hiding in the servants' quarters, her face still a canvas of purple and yellow bruises, her ribs wrapped tight beneath her shirt. The other Omegas gave her pitying looks, but kept their distance. Associating with a traitor, even one who'd been beaten into submission, was dangerous when the pack's hierarchy was being rewritten. But Marin had no intention of staying hidden. Not today. Not when she knew exactly what Darius was planning. The great hall was packed when she slipped in through the side entrance, pressing herself against the back wall where she could see everything without being noticed. 150 wolves filled the space, their collective energy crackling with anticipation and unease. Pack gatherings were rare, reserved for momentous occasions, challenges, ceremonies, declarations of war, or the transfer of power from one alpha to another. Darius stood on the raised platform at the front of the hall, flanked by his loyalists, looking every inch the leader he'd been positioning himself to become. He'd dressed for the occasion, formal pack regalia that was just shy of alpha ceremonial wear, walking the line between respectful and presumptuous. The pack elders sat in their designated seats, their faces carefully neutral. Maren noticed that several of Lucien's oldest supporters were absent, likely still exiled to border patrols or conveniently reassigned to duties that kept them far from this gathering. "Thank you all for coming," Darius began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. He had the gift of command presence, that natural authority that made wolves listen even when they disagreed. "I know these past 3 weeks have been difficult. Uncertain. We've all been hoping for a miracle, praying that our alpha would recover and return to us whole and strong." He paused, letting the weight of false grief settle over the room. Several wolves nodded, their expressions somber. "But hope, no matter how fierce, cannot change reality," Darius continued. "I've consulted with our healer, with the elders, with every medical expert we could reach. The consensus is unanimous. Alpha Lucien's condition is permanent. His wolf is gone. The bond that connected him to his command, to this pack, has been severed beyond repair." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some wolves had known this already, but hearing it stated so definitively made it real in a way rumors couldn't. "A pack cannot survive without leadership," Darius said, his voice growing stronger, more assured. "We've been operating in a state of emergency these past weeks, but that cannot continue indefinitely. Our enemies watch for weakness. Our allies question our stability. We need an alpha, not just in name, but in truth." He gestured to a table behind him where several documents were laid out, visible to the front rows if not the entire hall. "I didn't make this decision lightly. I've spent weeks reviewing our pack's history, examining Alpha Lucien's recent decisions and behavior. What I found troubled me." The murmurs grew louder, more agitated. Maren's hands clenched into fists against her sides. "Financial records showing increasingly erratic resource allocation," Darius said, his tone heavy with regret. "Disciplinary reports that were harsh to the point of cruelty, particularly toward lower-ranked wolves. Testimony from pack members who feared to speak up while he was in power, but who've now come forward with concerning accounts of his leadership. It was all lies." Maren knew it with absolute certainty because she'd been one of those lower-ranked wolves, and Lucien had been the only alpha who'd ever treated her like she mattered. But she could see the effect Darius's words were having. Wolves who'd been uncertain now nodding, wolves who'd been questioning now looking convinced. "I didn't want to believe it either," Darius said, his voice dropping to something intimate, confessional. "Lucien was my alpha, my friend. But the evidence is undeniable. Perhaps his wolf knew. Perhaps that's why it abandoned him, because some part of him recognized he was no longer fit to lead." The crowd's energy was shifting, Maren could feel it. Wolves who'd been mourning were now reassessing. Wolves who'd been loyal were now questioning whether that loyalty had been misplaced. "According to pack law," Darius said, pulling out a leather-bound volume, the official pack codes that governed everything from succession to justice, when an alpha is permanently incapacitated and no clear heir has been designated, the pack may vote to install new leadership. "This isn't a challenge. This isn't a coup. This is us choosing survival over sentiment." He looked out over the assembled wolves, his expression grave and determined. "I'm not asking you to forget Lucien Varen. I'm asking you to remember what this pack needs. Strength. Stability. An alpha who can actually lead, not a broken man clinging to a title he can no longer fulfill." Elder Sienna stood, her voice cutting through the rising noise. "And what of the alpha himself? Shouldn't he have a voice in this decision?" "The alpha is unconscious," Darius said with carefully practiced patience. "He has been for 3 weeks. Even if we brought him here, he cannot speak, cannot defend himself, cannot participate in his own succession. Keeping him in power out of pity serves no one, not him, not us, not the pack's future. Sienna looked like she wanted to argue further, but two other elders placed hands on her shoulders, pulling her back down. The message was clear, this battle was already lost. "I'm calling for a vote," Darius announced. "All those in favor of accepting the reality of our situation and moving forward with new leadership, stand with me. All those who wish to remain bound to a dying alpha and watch this pack crumble around us, stay where you are." The first wolves rose immediately, Darius's inner circle, the ambitious ones who'd been waiting for this moment. Then more, cautiously, looking around to see who else was standing. Then more still, until nearly 3/4 of the pack was on their feet. Merrin remained pressed against the wall, one of the few still seated, watching the mass betrayal unfold with sick certainty. Darius smiled. "Then by the will of this pack and the authority granted by our laws, I formally." The doors at the back of the hall slammed open, and Lucien Varon walked through them. Chapter 7. Except he didn't walk. He stumbled, barely upright, supported between two of Darius's guards who gripped his arms like he might collapse at any moment. His skin was pale as death, his breathing labored, and he looked exactly like what everyone believed him to be, a broken alpha on the edge of dying. Merrin's heart lurched. For a moment, she forgot the hand squeeze, forgot the awareness in his eyes, and genuinely feared that she'd been wrong. That he really was as shattered as he appeared, and Darius had dragged him here for some final humiliation. Darius said, and his tone carried surprised pleasure that was too perfect to be genuine. "Our alpha honors us with his presence." How convenient. The guards hauled Lucien down the center aisle as the pack parted like a river around rocks, no one willing to touch him, no one meeting his eyes. They deposited him at the base of the platform, and Lucien sagged forward, catching himself on his hands and knees. His head hung low, his hair falling forward to hide his face, every line of his body screaming defeat. The pack watched in silence. Not the reverent silence of respect, but the uncomfortable quiet of witnesses to something shameful. Their alpha, reduced to this. Crawling before his beta like a dog. "Look at him," Darius said softly, but his voice carried through the hall's perfect acoustics. "Is this what you want leading you? A man who can't even stand in his own pack hall." No one answered. No one needed to. The evidence was right there on the floor before them, undeniable and pathetic. "I take no pleasure in this," Darius continued, descending from the platform to stand over Lucien. "But pack law is clear. An alpha who cannot fulfill his duties must be released from his burden. It's a mercy, really. Better a clean death with dignity than this lingering suffering." He pulled a blade from his belt, ceremonial, silver-edged, the kind used for formal challenges. "Does anyone stand for him? Does anyone here claim that Lucien Varon is still fit to lead the Crescent Moon Pack?" The silence stretched. 150 wolves, and not a single voice raised in defense. Merrin felt something break open in her chest, a grief so profound it made her previous pain feel insignificant. They were going to let it happen. All of them. Every wolf who'd sworn loyalty, every warrior who'd fought beside him, every pack member who'd prospered under his leadership, they were going to watch him die without saying a word. "Then by pack law and common mercy," Darius said, raising the blade, "I release you from." "No." The word came from Merrin's throat before her mind could stop it, and suddenly she was moving, pushing through the crowd of wolves who towered over her, shoving past bodies that could have crushed her without effort. She broke through the front line and threw herself between Darius and Lucien, her battered body positioning itself as a shield that wouldn't stop anything but stood there anyway. The entire hall went silent. Even Darius seemed momentarily stunned, his blade frozen mid-arc. "You," he said finally, his voice dripping with contempt. "The Omega who doesn't know when she's beaten. I should have killed you in the courtyard." "Then do it now," Merrin said, and her voice was steady despite the terror flooding her system. "But you'll have to go through me first." Darius laughed, and several of his wolves joined in, the sound cruel and mocking. "Go through you? Little Omega, I could snap you in half without breaking stride. I know, Marin said. She glanced down at Lucien, still on his hands and knees, still maintaining that posture of broken defeat. But his fingers had shifted, pressing into the floor in a pattern that looked random unless you were watching closely. Unless you knew he was counting down. But he's still my alpha. And I won't let you kill him without a fight. Your alpha, Darius repeated, shaking his head. Look around you, Omega. Look at all these wolves. Gamma, Delta, Beta-ranked warriors who could tear you apart. Where are they? Who else is standing with you? Marin did look. She turned and faced the assembled pack, meeting the eyes of wolves who'd worked beside her, eaten at the same tables, existed in the same space for years. She saw shame in some faces, approval in others. But mostly she saw relief that someone else was taking the stand so they didn't have to. No one, she said quietly, turning back to Darius. No one is standing with me. Which tells you everything you need to know about this pack's loyalty. Something flickered across Darius's face, anger, perhaps, or recognition that she'd just made him and everyone watching look like cowards. Your loyalty is admirable, he said coldly. But it won't save him. Step aside, or I'll make what I did to you in the courtyard look like kindness. No. Darius moved then, faster than she could track, his hand closing around her throat and lifting her off her feet. Marin's vision blurred, her hands clawing uselessly at his wrist as he held her suspended, a demonstration of exactly how powerless she was. This is what loyalty to a dead alpha buys you, Darius announced to the crowd, his grip tightening. Pain. Suffering. A pointless death defending something already lost. Through the roaring in her ears, through the darkness creeping into her vision, Marin heard something that made her heart soar even as her lungs burned for air. Laughter. Low, dark, and absolutely merciless. Lucien was laughing. Darius's head snapped down, and Marin felt his grip slacken just slightly as confusion replaced his certainty. Because the alpha who'd been broken and helpless on the floor was rising, unfolding to his full height with the fluid grace of a predator that had been playing dead. 21 days, Lucien said, his voice clear and strong and carrying the unmistakable weight of alpha command that punched through the hall like a physical force. That's how long it took for every single one of you to betray me. His eyes swept the crowd, and wolves began backing away, their certainty crumbling as they realized what they were seeing. What they'd done. Every single one, Lucien repeated, and the words carried centuries of disappointment. Except her. He looked at Marin, still dangling from Darius's grip, and his eyes blazed with something that was part rage, part pride, and entirely possessive. Let her go, Darius, Lucien said softly. And let me show you what happens when you fail an alpha's test. Chapter 8. Darius didn't let her go. Instead, his face twisted with rage and something deeper fear masked as fury, and he threw Marin aside like she weighed nothing. She hit the floor hard, her already damaged ribs screaming in protest, but she was alive. Breathing. Watching. Test? Darius spat, but his voice had lost its confident resonance. You think this was a test? You think I'll believe you faked everything, the injuries, the severed wolf, 3 weeks of playing corpse, just to see who'd betray you? Believe what you want, Lucien said, taking a step forward. The crowd parted instinctively, wolves scrambling back from the alpha they'd just voted to kill. The evidence is standing right in front of you. Darius's hand tightened on the ceremonial blade, his knuckles white. You're bluffing. You're desperate, playing mind games because you know you're finished. If you had your strength, your wolf, your command, you would have stopped me days ago. You would have prevented all of this. Would I? Lucien's smile was cold as winter. Or would I have missed the opportunity to see exactly what kind of wolves I've been leading? To see which of you valued power over loyalty, ambition over honor, convenience over courage. He spread his arms wide, addressing the entire hall. I gave you everything. Protection. Prosperity. Fair leadership. And the moment you thought I was weak, you turned on me like starving dogs fighting over a carcass. This is insane, Darius said, but he was backing up now, his confidence crumbling. The healer confirmed your wolf was severed. The elders saw the wounds. Everyone saw what I wanted them to see, Lucien interrupted. What you wanted to see. Because you've been waiting for this moment since the day I took this title, haven't you, Darius? Waiting for your chance to take what you thought should have been yours. Darius's expression shuddered, calculation replacing panic. Fine. Let's say you're telling the truth. Let's say this was all an elaborate performance. It doesn't matter anymore. He gestured to the assembled pack. They've made their choice. They voted. Pack law is pack law, even you can't overturn a legitimate succession vote. Legitimate, Lucien repeated, tasting the word. You fabricated evidence, manipulated testimony, and isolated me from anyone who might have defended me. But yes, let's call it legitimate. Darius smiled, sensing victory despite the fear still tightening his features. Then step down. Accept the vote. Walk away with your life, and we'll. No, Lucien said simply. Because you made one critical mistake. What mistake? You touched her. Lucien's eyes found Marin on the floor, and the look in them made something primal and powerful surge through her battered body. You hurt what's mine. And for that, there is no law, no vote, no surrender. Darius moved then, pure instinct overriding strategy. He lunged at Lucien with the blade, aiming for the heart, putting all his strength behind the killing blow. If Lucien was bluffing, this would end it. If he wasn't. The blade never reached its target. Lucien caught Darius's wrist mid-strike, and the sound of bones breaking echoed through the silent hall like gunshots. Darius screamed, the ceremonial knife clattering to the floor, but Lucien didn't release him. Instead, he pulled Darius close, his other hand gripping the back of the beta's neck. I want you to understand something, Lucien said, his voice conversational despite the violence in his grip. Every insult, every disrespect, every moment of pain you inflicted on me these past weeks, I let happen. I watched you scheme and manipulate and corrupt. I let you believe you'd won. He tightened his grip, and Darius made a choked sound of agony. But the moment you laid hands on her, the moment you beat her in that courtyard, the moment you put your fingers around her throat, you stopped playing my game and started playing a different one entirely. Then Lucien's power exploded outward, and the alpha command that had been dormant for 3 weeks slammed into every wolf in the hall like a physical blow. Wolves dropped to their knees involuntarily, their heads bowing under the sheer weight of his dominance. Even the strongest among them couldn't resist it, their wolves whimpering in submission to the authority they'd betrayed. All except Marin, who felt the command wash over her like a warm wave, present but not crushing, acknowledging but not demanding. Because she was different. Because he'd claimed her as his, and the bond between them hummed with recognition. Lucien addressed the kneeling pack, his voice carrying absolute authority. You failed. Every single one of you who stood with Darius, who voted for succession, who watched your alpha crawl and said nothing, you failed the most basic test of pack loyalty. He released Darius, letting the broken man collapse at his feet. Beta Darius, you're expelled from the Crescent Moon pack. You have 24 hours to leave our territory. If you're found here after that, I will kill you myself. Darius clutched his shattered wrist, his face pale with shock and pain. You can't, the vote. The vote was based on false pretenses, Lucien said coldly. Which makes it void. And even if it wasn't, I'm still your alpha. My command still runs through every wolf in this hall. You feel it, don't you? The bond you thought was broken. The pack remained frozen on their knees, unable to rise, unable to even lift their heads. The command held them in place as effectively as chains. As for the rest of you, Lucien continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled wolves, you will spend the next weeks proving you deserve to remain in this pack. You will earn back the trust you shattered, the loyalty you abandoned, the honor you traded for convenience. And if you can't, if you won't, then you'll follow Darius into exile. He turned and walked to where Marin still lay, extending his hand to her. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet, and the entire pack watched as their alpha, the one they'd just voted to kill, held the battered Omega with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the brutality he'd just displayed. This wolf, Lucien announced, his arm steady around Marin's shoulders as she swayed slightly, showed more loyalty in 3 weeks than all of you have shown in years. She stood alone. She bled for me. She defied her beta and faced death rather than abandon her alpha. His eyes blazed as he looked at his pack. Remember that. Remember what true loyalty looks like. Because from this day forward, it's the only currency that matters in my pack. Chapter 9. The pack remained on their knees for 3 hours. Lucien didn't release the command immediately, didn't offer them the mercy of quick forgiveness. He let them kneel in the Great Hall while he systematically dismantled everything Darius had built. The beta was dragged out first, still clutching his shattered wrist, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. 6 of his closest conspirators followed, the wolves who'd fabricated evidence, who'd beaten Marin in the courtyard, who'd actively worked to isolate and destroy their alpha. They were given the same ultimatum, 24 hours to leave or face execution. None of them argued. They'd seen what Lucien could do when he stopped pretending to be weak. Marin watched it all from a chair someone had brought for her, her body finally giving in to 3 weeks of accumulated damage. The pack healer, the sincere one who genuinely believed Lucien was dying, worked on her injuries with trembling hands and whispered apologies that Marin accepted with quiet grace. "You knew," the healer said softly as she cleaned the cut above Marin's eye. "You knew he was faking, and you still defended him." "I suspected," Marin corrected, wincing as the antiseptic burned. "But it didn't matter. Fake or real, he was still my alpha." The healer paused, meeting her eyes with something like awe. "You're either the bravest wolf I've ever met, or the most foolish." Marin thought about Lucien's words in the hall, about how he'd said the same thing. "Maybe both," she said with a small smile that pulled at her split lip. "Maybe that's what loyalty requires sometimes." When the last of the traitors had been expelled and the healer had finished her work, Lucien released the command. The pack rose slowly, shamefully, unable to meet their alpha's eyes. Many were crying. Others looked shell-shocked, as if they couldn't quite believe what they'd done, what they'd almost allowed to happen. Lucien let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, and then he spoke. "I didn't want to believe it," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "When I planned this test, some part of me hoped I was wrong. That my pack, the wolves I'd protected and led for 12 years, would prove their loyalty ran deeper than convenience." He moved through the crowd, and they parted before him like he was made of fire. "I told myself maybe a few would fail. The ambitious ones, the young wolves who hadn't yet learned what true loyalty meant. But I genuinely believed that most of you, the warriors I'd fought beside, the families I'd sheltered, the wolves who'd prospered under my leadership, I believed you would stand." His expression hardened. "You didn't. 90% of this pack voted to kill me based on fabricated evidence and 3 weeks of manufactured crisis. You didn't question. You didn't investigate. You didn't even hesitate." Elder Sienna stood, her voice shaking. "We failed you, Alpha. There's no excuse, no justification. We let fear and ambition blind us to the truth." "Yes," Lucien agreed simply. "You did." He turned back to where Marin sat, and something in his expression softened. "But she didn't. An Omega with everything to lose and nothing to gain. She defended me when I couldn't defend myself. She bled for me when everyone else turned away. She chose loyalty over survival, honor over safety." Lucien crossed to Marin and extended his hand, not to help her stand this time, but palm up, an offering and a question all at once. "Marin Alira, the pack believes you're weak because you're an Omega. They believe strength is measured in muscle and dominance and the ability to force others into submission." Marin placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth and calluses, the strength he'd hidden so perfectly beneath his disguise. Her heart hammered as she realized what was happening, what he was about to do. "But I've learned," Lucien continued, raising her to her feet, "that true strength is choosing to stand when standing means losing everything. True strength is protecting someone who can't protect themselves, even when no one else will. True strength is loyalty that can't be bought, threatened, or broken." He turned to face the pack, still holding Marin's hand. "Which is why, from this moment forward, Marin Alira is no longer an Omega of this pack." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several wolves looked confused, others shocked. A few, the ones who'd tormented her for years, looked genuinely horrified. "She is my Luna," Lucien announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority and unmistakable pride. "My mate, my equal, and the wolf who represents everything this pack should aspire to be. She will stand beside me as we rebuild what your betrayal nearly destroyed. And anyone who questions her authority, her position, or her worth will answer to me directly." The alpha command pulsed through his words, making it not just an announcement but a law, binding every wolf present to acknowledge and accept what he declared. Marin stood beside him, still bruised, still wearing her servant's clothes, still looking like exactly what she'd been that morning, a broken Omega who should have died in the courtyard. But Lucien's hand in hers was steady and warm, and when she looked up at him, she saw not just her alpha, but her mate, her future, and the wolf who'd seen her worth when no one else had. "The Crescent Moon Pack failed its test," Lucien said, addressing them all one final time. "You failed yourselves, you failed me, and you failed the very concept of loyalty. But Marin didn't. She passed when everyone else fell. And that makes her the only wolf in this entire compound who proved worthy of standing at an alpha's side." He raised their joined hands for everyone to see. "Learn from her. Become worthy of her example. Because under our leadership, this pack will be rebuilt on the foundation she represents, loyalty that can't be shaken, courage that can't be broken, and honor that means more than power." The pack knelt again, but this time it was voluntary, heads bowing not in submission to command, but in acknowledgement of truth. They'd witnessed a test, failed it spectacularly, and now watched as the one wolf they'd dismissed as worthless became the most important member of their pack. Marin stood beside her alpha, her mate, her Lucien, and felt something shift in her chest. Not just healing from the physical wounds, but transformation. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was leading. She was valued. She was home. And the pack that had once treated her like dirt would spend the rest of their lives learning what it meant to earn back the trust of their Luna.